John Miller was the kind of man who didn't like trouble. He lived in a small, quiet suburban neighborhood where most people waved politely in the morning and went about their day. He had no grand dreams of fame or wealth. All he wanted was peace, his morning coffee, and the comfort of his small garden. Every weekend, he would water his flowers, mow the grass, and sweep the walkway leading to his front door. It was a life of small routines, and John liked it that way. His mailbox, standing proudly at the edge of his driveway, was something he'd actually put more effort into than most people would think. It wasn't just a box to hold letters. To him, it was a symbol of order. He had painted it black, polished the metal handle, and replaced the post, just last year, with sturdy treated wood. Every time he'd walk past it, he felt a small spark of satisfaction. That little mailbox represented his home's neatness, but that peace didn't last. One morning, while walking out to collect his letters, John froze. The mailbox was leaning forward like a tired old man, the post cracked slightly near the base. The side was scratched and dented, and a corner of the metal door had been bent inward. His first thought was that maybe a delivery truck had accidentally hit it. He straightened it as best he could, tightened the screws, and told himself it was just bad luck. A week later, it happened again. This time, the mailbox wasn't just leaning, it was tilted at a dangerous angle, one more push away from snapping completely. The wood had fresh tire marks at the base, and the metal had another deep dent. John's jaw tightened. This wasn't an accident anymore. It kept happening, week after week. He would replace the screws, straighten the post, and sometimes repaint the scratches, only to find it damaged again days later. The situation began to get under his skin. Whoever was doing this didn't seem to care. They just kept running over his mailbox like it was some kind of sport. John didn't want to be paranoid. But by the third month, his frustration had reached a boiling point. He decided it was time to find out exactly who was responsible. So he went online, ordered a small motion-activated camera, installed it on the corner of his porch, aimed directly at the mailbox. The next morning, as he sipped his coffee, the camera alert went off. He opened the app on his phone and replayed the footage. There it was, clear as day. A silver SUV, pulling into the driveway across the street, clipped the side of his mailbox with the front bumper, bending it slightly before driving on like nothing happened. And in the driver's seat, Karen Thompson. Everyone in the neighborhood knew. Karen, she wasn't just a resident, she was one of the most vocal members of the HOA board. A self-declared protector of community standards. She was the type of person who'd knock on your door to complain about your grass being too long by half an inch or your garbage has been being too visible on collection day. She had a way of talking that made you feel like she wasn't just telling you something, she was declaring a law. And now, apparently, she was also the serial killer of mailboxes. John replayed the video several times to make sure he wasn't imagining it. Each time, he saw her SUV drift a little too close, the tire bump over the edge of his driveway, and the mailbox shudder from the hit. Sometimes she was on the phone, gesturing wildly with one hand. Once, she even seemed to laugh at something, completely unaware, or maybe completely unconcerned, about the damage she was causing. For the rest of the day, John's mind kept going back to the video. Part of him wanted to believe she didn't notice, that it was just careless driving. But another part, the part that had been watching his mailbox get destroyed for months, knew better. This wasn't random. It was her habit, her complete disregard for other people's property. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the street turned quiet, John stood by his window watching Karen's house. She lived in a 2-story beige home with perfectly trimmed hedges and 2 stone planters. By the front door, the kind of place she always bragged about keeping HOA approved, her silver SUV was parked in the driveway, looking innocent under the soft glow of the streetlight. He imagined walking over there, knocking on her door and showing her the video on his phone. He imagined her apologizing, maybe even offering to pay for the damage, but deep down, he suspected that wasn't how it would go. He had seen her in action before, the way she could twist a story, turn the blame onto someone else, and walk away without a shred of guilt. Still, he decided he would give her the benefit of the doubt at least once. Over the next few days, The damage didn't stop. Another dent, another scuff mark. It was like clockwork. The sound of a car scraping the post was becoming something John swore he could hear even from inside the house. One Friday afternoon, when he saw her SUV pulling into her driveway, he decided it was time. He grabbed his phone with the video ready to play and stepped outside. "Hey, Karen," he called out, walking across the street. She turned, sunglasses perched on her head, holding a reusable grocery bag. "Oh, John, what's up?" Her voice had that sugary sweet tone that always felt one step away from sarcasm. "Got a minute? I wanted to talk about something." He held up his phone. "I think you've been accidentally hitting my mailbox when you pull in. I have it on camera." Here, Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your mailbox?" "I don't think so." John pressed play. The short clip showed her SUV clipping the side of the mailbox and pulling into her driveway. Instead of the apology he expected, Karen smirked. "Well, maybe your mailbox is too close to the road. Honestly, John, it is kind of sticking out. You might want to move it back a bit. It could be a hazard for drivers." He blinked. "It's exactly where it's supposed to be. USPS guidelines." "Oh, come on," she interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "Don't get technical. It just looks awkward there. It's not exactly, community friendly. I'll bring it up at the next HOA meeting. We might have to vote on it." John felt his jaw tighten. "Karen, you've hit it multiple times. It's not a hazard. You're just not paying attention." She laughed lightly, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that meant she found it funny. It was the kind of laugh people use when they're brushing you off. "Well, accidents happen. You should really think about a different style of mailbox. Something smaller, maybe. That one is kind of an eyesore." With that, she turned away, unlocked her front door, and stepped inside without another word. As the door closed, John stood there for a moment, stunned. The next morning, he found another fresh scrape on the mailbox. Whether it was deliberate or just her usual careless driving, John realized one thing very clearly. This wasn't going to stop just because he asked nicely. And somewhere, deep inside him, a quiet part of his mind began to think about a different kind of solution. Not a polite conversation, not a complaint to the HOA. Something that would make her really notice the next time she drove too close. John didn't sleep well that night. Conversation with Karen kept replaying in his mind over and over, like a song stuck on repeat. Every time he thought about her smug little smirk, her dismissive tone, and the way she turned it all around. To make it his fault, he felt his stomach twist. It wasn't just about the mailbox anymore. It was about respect, or rather her complete lack of it. John had grown up believing that if you treated people fairly, they'd treat you the same. But Karen was living proof that some people didn't play by those rules. The following days were tense. John found himself looking out the window whenever he heard the sound of tires on asphalt, his eyes tracking that silver SUV as it came and went. It became almost a habit, listening for her engine, watching the way she pulled into her driveway without even glancing at the narrow space between their properties. Sometimes she missed the mailbox entirely, but most times there was that little thunk of bumper meeting wood or metal. She didn't even slow down. Finally, one Wednesday afternoon, John decided to make another attempt. Maybe if he spoke to her more calmly without the phone or video as evidence, she'd at least see reason. So, when he spotted her watering her front hedge, he crossed the street. "Karen," he started, trying to keep his voice even, "I just want to talk one more time about the mailbox." Yeah, she didn't even look at him at first, just kept spraying the water in neat measured lines along the hedge. Oh, John again with the mailbox. "I told you, it's not my fault. Placement is just bad." "It's not bad placement," he said firmly. "It's the same spot mailboxes have been in for years on this street, when you've hit it more than anyone else." She lowered the hose and finally met his eyes. I could take this as harassment. You keep accusing me of damaging your property when I haven't done anything intentional." John felt his patience thinning. It doesn't have to be intentional. It's still damage. And if it keeps happening, I'll have to. You'll have to what? She interrupted sharply, the sugary tone gone now. "Complain to the HOA. Go ahead, I'm on the board. I'll tell them your mailbox doesn't meet the aesthetic standards for the neighborhood. They might make you remove it entirely." "That was it?" The subtle threat. The HOA card, Karen, was well known for using the HOA as her personal weapon. The rules were supposed to keep the neighborhood nice, but with Karen involved, they became something else, a tool to punish anyone who crossed her or didn't follow her own idea of perfect. John realized something in that moment. She wasn't going to admit fault because she didn't care about fault. She only cared about control. She had convinced herself that she was in the right. The conversation ended badly. Karen told him she had better things to do and walked away without another glance. And as if to prove her point, she backed. Her SUV out of the driveway swung the wheel a little too far, toward his side, and bumped the mailbox again on her way out. That night, John sat at his kitchen table, staring at the dented mailbox through the window. He could almost hear it mocking him, standing there crooked and battered. A constant reminder that he'd lost the argument before it had even begun. He thought about calling the police, but he knew how that would go. They'd say it was a civil matter or that there wasn't enough proof of intent to press charges. He thought about going to the HOA president, but Karen had already made it clear she would spin the story to make him the villain. The next HOA meeting only confirmed that it was held in the small community center at the end of the street. Folding chairs lined the room, a pot of lukewarm coffee sat on a table, and about a dozen residents had shown up. John sat in the back, quietly listening as Karen stood at the front with the other board members. Near the end of the meeting, she brought it up not as I've been hitting John's mailbox, but as we've had some complaints about mailboxes being too close to the street, which could be dangerous for drivers and delivery trucks. John's eyes widened. She wasn't just deflecting blame. She was turning his complaint into a neighborhood issue. I think we should consider setting a standard distance from the curb, she continued, smiling faintly as she scanned the room. Keep everything uniform and safe. Some people nodded. Others just looked bored. Nobody knew this was about his mailbox. John stayed quiet. He knew speaking up would only make him look defensive, and Karen would use that to her advantage. When the meeting ended, she walked past him with a polite, almost sweet smile. See you around, John? It was the kind of smile that told him she thought she'd won. The days after that were worse. If she hadn't been hitting the mailbox on purpose before, she was definitely doing it now. The camera caught her swerving closer than ever, sometimes glancing in her side mirror as she did. It was almost like she wanted him to see. John tried to focus on other things, his work, his garden, his evening walks. But every morning he'd find some new mark or dent. It wasn't just about the cost of repairs anymore. It was the principle. And that principle burned in his chest like a slow fire. It was growing hotter every time he saw her SUV. One Saturday morning he was outside replacing the screws yet again when his neighbor from 2 houses down, an older man named Frank, wandered over. Mailbox trouble again? Frank asked, shaking his head. Yeah, John said, tightening a bolt. Same person? Every week. Frank lowered his voice. Karen? John nodded. Frank gave a small, humorless chuckle. Figures. She's been on my case for 3 years about my backyard fence. Said it's too high. Told the board I was lowering property values. Shh. Hearing that made John feel less alone, but it also confirmed what he already knew. Karen wasn't going to stop. Not because he asked, not because he showed her evidence, and certainly not because of any HOA rules. That night, as he sat in the living room watching TV, John found himself staring at the tools in his garage through the open door. He thought about the pile of scrap metal he'd been meaning to get rid of, the leftover bags of concrete from when he'd fixed his garden path, the old steel posts buried behind his shed. The idea came slowly at first, just a vague thought. But the longer he sat there, the clearer it became. He couldn't stop her from driving past his house. He couldn't make her care about his property, but he could make sure the next time she hit that mailbox, it wouldn't be his problem. It would be hers. And for the first time in weeks, John smiled. The rain had started late in the night and carried on until morning, leaving the air heavy and the street glistening. John stood at his window with a mug of coffee in hand, staring at the crooked mailbox. The wood post had finally given up. It leaned so far forward now that the box looked like it was bowing to passersby. The last hit had been brutal, and there was no fixing it this time with a few screws or a coat of paint. The post was split right down the middle, jagged and splintered. He knew exactly who had done it. Didn't even need to check the camera. Still, habit made him open the app on his phone and scroll to the footage from the night before. There it was, Karen's silver SUV creeping past his driveway, slowing down as it reached the mailbox, then swerving slightly toward it. The front bumper connected with a dull thud. She didn't stop. She didn't even hesitate. The SUV rolled on into her driveway, headlights cutting through the misty night before disappearing as the engine shut off. John replayed it twice, just to burn the image into his mind. She wasn't even pretending it was an accident anymore. That was the part that got to him, the casualness. Like his property was nothing more than a speed bump on her way home. He put the phone down and sat heavily at the kitchen table. For a long time, he just stared at his hands, feeling a tightness in his chest that had been building for months. He had tried everything, talking to her face to face, showing her proof, even sitting quietly through the HOA meeting while she twisted the narrative to make him look like the problem. And now, here he was, staring at the final piece of wood that used to be his mailbox. Realizing that all his reasonable efforts had done nothing, this wasn't about a mailbox anymore. It was about being pushed over and over until you either give up or push back. Later that morning, he called the HOA president, a man named Peter who was always polite but clearly hated conflict. John explained calmly at first what had happened, the repeated damage, the proof on camera, the blatant disregard. "I understand, John," Peter said in that careful voice people use when they're trying not to take sides. "But this really sounds like a neighbor-to-neighbor dispute. The HOA's role is to maintain community standards, not mediate personal issues." John's jaw tightened. "It's not a personal issue when someone keeps destroying my property." Peter hesitated. "Well, if it's true, she's hitting it on purpose, maybe you should file a police report." "I could do that," John said, "but will the police care about a mailbox? They'll just call it an accident?" "I'm sorry," Peter replied, "but the HOA can't get involved unless it's a violation of our property standards. Technically, her driving doesn't fall under that." John hung up, feeling more alone than ever. The HOA wouldn't help. Police would probably shrug it off. And Karen clearly wasn't going to stop out of guilt. That left him with only one option, to solve it himself. The thought started as a whisper in the back of his mind, but it grew louder as the day went on. He could replace the mailbox again, sure. But why make it easy for her to destroy it? Why not make it so that the next time she hit it, she'd regret it? By afternoon, the plan was fully formed. He drove to the hardware store, the kind of place, with the smell of sawdust and motor oil hanging in the air. He bought a few things that wouldn't draw suspicion: a new wooden post, some paint, a metal mailbox to replace the old one. But the real materials came from the contractor section: a thick steel pipe, heavy enough that he had to lift it with both hands, and 3 80-pound bags of quick-dry concrete. The cashier didn't ask questions. Back home, John set the supplies in his garage and spent the next hour rummaging through the far corners for the tools he'd need: an electric drill, heavy-duty bolts, his old welding kit from years ago when he'd tried making garden sculptures, a grinder to smooth the steel edges. Every item added a small thrill of satisfaction to his chest. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed going over every step in his head, imagining how it would feel when she finally realized her bumper wasn't going to win this battle. The image made him smile in the dark. The next morning, he started work. From the street, it looked like he was just replacing the mailbox like any normal homeowner would after damage. Neighbors passed by, waving casually, none of them knowing what was really going on. First, he dug a hole deeper than before, nearly 3 feet down. He set the steel pipe inside, making sure it was perfectly straight. Then came the concrete. Bag after bag, he poured it into the hole, mixing it with water until it was solid and immovable. The steel pipe wasn't going anywhere. It was now one with the earth beneath his driveway. Once the concrete set, slid the wooden post over the steel, trimming it so the disguise was perfect. To anyone walking by, it looked like an ordinary mailbox post. He attached the new metal box to the top, painted it black, just like the old one, stepped back to admire his work. What no one could see was the core, the steel pipe running through the middle, bolted and anchored deep into the ground. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore. It was a fortress. He left the camera in its usual spot, aimed at the driveway, and went back inside. Now, all that was left to do was wait. The waiting, however, was harder than he expected. Every time he heard a car outside, his heart skipped a beat. He checked the camera more often than usual, sometimes rewinding the footage even if there was nothing there. Days passed. Karen came and went, but for whatever reason, she didn't hit the mailbox at first. He worried she'd noticed something was different. Maybe she'd finally learned to steer clear. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time. She was too set in her habits, too careless to change for long. On the third night after installing the new mailbox, John sat in his living room with the TV on low volume. It was nearly 8 o'clock when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of her SUV pulling into the street. He muted the TV and leaned forward, watching through the blinds. Her headlights swept across his driveway as she approached. Then, as predictably as the sunrise, her SUV drifted toward the mailbox. This was it. John's heart was beating faster than usual as he watched the headlights creep closer. He had imagined this moment so many times over the past few days that it almost felt like déjà vu. But this wasn't just in his head anymore. This was
real.
The trap was set, the camera was recording, and the reinforced mailbox stood like a silent soldier at the edge of his driveway. Waiting. Karen's silver SUV rolled down the street at the same casual pace as always, the kind of slow, comfortable speed of someone who thinks they own the place. She was in her usual position, sitting slightly forward in the driver's seat. One hand on the wheel, the other probably holding her phone. John leaned just enough to keep her in view through the blinds as she neared her driveway. The familiar drift began. Her wheels edged toward the right, toward the space where the mailbox stood. She didn't slow down. She didn't even glance at it. Then it happened. The sound was nothing like the soft thunk he'd heard so many times before. This was a deep, solid crunch, followed by the screech of metal bending in protest. The SUV jolted violently to the side, the front bumper caving inward as the headlight exploded in a shower of plastic shards. Karen hit the brakes so hard the tires squealed against the asphalt. Her SUV stopped half in her driveway, half in the street, tilted awkwardly, as if even the car was stunned by what had just happened. For a moment, she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring forward like her brain was still processing. Then she flung open the door and stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Even from across the street, John could see the damage. The reinforced mailbox hadn't moved an inch. The steel core, hidden under the wooden post, stood perfectly straight and proud. But Karen's SUV, well, it looked like it had just lost a fight with a wall. The bumper was cracked straight through, the headlight completely gone. The hood had a noticeable dent where it had buckled against the force. Karen bent down, inspecting the damage, muttering something under her breath. She ran her hand along the mailbox post, almost as if she was trying to figure out why it hadn't bent like it always did. Then she stepped back and glared at it like it had personally offended her. John stayed hidden behind the blinds, watching with quiet satisfaction. Every part of him wanted to smirk, but he kept his face straight, his breathing slow. This was better than any argument, better than any HOA meeting. This was proof, undeniable, physical proof that her careless driving had finally met its art. She pulled her phone out and started dialing. Even without hearing her, John could imagine the conversation, probably calling someone to complain, maybe even trying to spin the story, so it sounded like he had done something wrong. A few minutes later, the flashing blue and red lights of a police cruiser rolled down the street. The officer stepped out, a tall man with a calm demeanor, and walked over to Karen. John turned up the volume on his porch camera feed, which had a microphone. "Officer, I want to report that my neighbor has set up a dangerous obstruction on the street," Karen began, pointing dramatically at the mailbox. "It's not a normal post. It's reinforced with something. Look at my car." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, this is a mailbox. It's required by law to be sturdy enough to withstand normal use. What exactly happened? I was pulling into my driveway and she paused, probably trying to make it sound like the mailbox had jumped in front of her car and it's way too solid. This isn't normal wood. He's trying to damage people's cars. Do you hit mailboxes often, ma'am? The officer asked evenly. Karen bristled. Of course not. This one's just in the wrong place, I've told him before. The officer walked over to the mailbox, giving it a quick inspection. This is well within USPS regulations for placement and height, and it's on his property line, not yours. Hush. But it's reinforced, Karen snapped. Feel it. I'm not here to feel it, the officer replied, glancing at the deep dent in her bumper. I'm here to determine if a crime has been committed. So far, all I see is that you hit his mailbox. John decided now was the right moment to step outside. He opened his front door, keeping his expression neutral, and walked toward the group. Evening, officer, he said calmly. I have security footage of my neighbor hitting my mailbox repeatedly over the past few months. Night was no different. Karen whipped around, eyes flashing. You trapped me? John shrugged. I installed a legal regulation standard mailbox. That's all. If you hit it, that's on you. The officer turned to John. Do you have that footage? Yes, sir, John said, holding out his phone. He played a few clips, the SUV clipping the post again and again on different days. Sometimes while Karen was clearly looking away or talking on the phone. Then, finally, the clip from tonight, showing the car making direct, forceful contact with the new post. The officer nodded slowly. Ma'am, this looks like repeated negligence. You're responsible for the damage to your own vehicle, and you may also be liable for the cost of any repairs to his mailbox, if it had been damaged. Karen's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to find the right words. But nothing came out. I suggest, the officer continued, that you be more careful pulling into your driveway in the future. She glared at both of them, but there was nothing left to argue. The officer handed her a small card with the case number for the incident and left. The cruiser's lights fading into the distance. Karen got back into her SUV, the broken headlight hanging awkwardly, and pulled the rest of the way into her driveway. She slammed the door and disappeared into her house without another word. John stood there for a moment, the cool night air brushing against his face. The street was quiet again, except for the faint creak of his mailbox settling back into stillness. It looked untouched, like it had never been hit at all. Inside, he poured himself a glass of water and sat down at the kitchen table. For the first time in months, the sight of his mailbox didn't fill him with frustration. Instead, it made him feel a deep, quiet satisfaction. Not because he had won against Karen, but because he'd done it without yelling, without stooping to her level, and without breaking a single rule. He had played the long game. And tonight, the long game had paid off. The morning after the incident, the street was unusually quiet. Normally, there would be the sound of doors slamming, engines starting, and neighbors heading out for work or errands. But today, it felt like the whole neighborhood had hit a pause button, as if word had already started to spread about what had happened the night before. John sipped his coffee by the window, watching the empty road. The mailbox stood tall and straight, not a single scratch on it. The black paint still gleamed. Faintly in the early sunlight, it looked almost smug, like it knew it had won the fight. Across the street, Karen's silver SUV sat in her driveway, looking far less proud. The cracked bumper and missing headlight were still there, now fully visible in daylight. John noticed she hadn't driven it anywhere since the officer left the night before. Around mid-morning, Frank from 2 houses down stopped by. He leaned on the railing of John's porch, his eyes drifting toward the undamaged mailbox. There was some excitement last night, Frank said with a knowing grin. John just shrugged. Mailbox held up fine. That's not what Karen's bumper says, Frank replied, chuckling. She's been telling anyone who will listen that you built some kind of booby trap. John smiled faintly. A perfectly legal, regulation-approved booby trap. Frank laughed out loud at that. Good for you. About time someone stood up to her. As the day went on, John noticed more subtle changes. When Karen finally left her house in the afternoon, not in the SUV, but in a small backup car he hadn't seen before, she avoided looking toward his side of the street. Her eyes stayed locked straight ahead as she pulled out of her driveway, turning the wheel extra wide to make sure she stayed far away from the mailbox. That became her new habit. Every time she drove in or out, she gave the mailbox an exaggerated amount of space, almost hugging the opposite curb. It was such a dramatic change from her old careless swerving that it made John shake his head in amusement. Within a week, other neighbors started making small comments when they saw him. "Mailbox is looking good these days. Still standing. Huh. I think you've created the Fort Knox of mailboxes." Even people who didn't usually talk to John seemed to know the story. Apparently, someone had shared the footage, not just the final hit, but the compilation of months' worth of clips, and it had made the rounds in the community. Some saw it as a lesson in persistence. Others as a piece of neighborhood entertainment. Either way, everyone now knew exactly who had been damaging the mailbox and how that little war had ended. At the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere felt different. John sat in his usual seat near the back, but this time people nodded at him in a way they hadn't before. A few even smiled, as if to say, "Well done." Karen was there too, sitting stiffly at the front table. Her voice was the same, sharp, controlled, but she seemed less confident than usual.
Oh.
When it came time for open discussion, she didn't bring up the mailbox. She didn't mention its placement or the supposed hazard it posed. She didn't look in John's direction once. After the meeting ended, as people filed out, a couple of neighbors stopped to talk to him. "You handled that better than I would have." One said, "You didn't just solve your problem." Another added, "You gave the rest of us hope." John didn't know about giving people hope, but he had to admit it felt good to see the shift in how people treated him. Before, he'd been just another quiet neighbor. Now he was the guy who had stood up to Karen and won. Weeks passed, and the mailbox became a kind of silent landmark. People would joke about it in passing. Careful around John's place, the mailbox bites back. Some parents even used it as a teaching tool for their kids learning to drive. "See that? Don't get too close, or you'll end up like Karen's car." As for Karen, her behavior changed in more ways than just her driving. She stopped confronting people about small things like slightly overgrown grass or trash cans left out a little too long. She still attended HOA meetings, still spoke her mind. But there was a hesitation in her tone now, like she was calculating whether it was worth the trouble. John never rubbed it in her face. He never brought up the incident again. It wasn't his style. For him, the satisfaction wasn't in gloating. It was in knowing that he'd protected his property and sent a message without breaking the law or losing his temper. Every so often, he'd glance at the mailbox while walking to his car, and it would give him that same small spark of satisfaction it used to when it was brand new. Only now, that feeling was stronger. It wasn't just a symbol of neatness anymore. It was a symbol of standing your ground. One crisp autumn morning, about 2 months after the incident, John was out raking leaves when Karen happened to pass by on foot, walking her small dog. She slowed as she approached his driveway, her eyes flicking briefly toward the mailbox. "Morning," John said politely. Not breaking his rhythm with the rake, Karen hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. Morning. Wasn't much. But it was the first civil exchange they'd had since this whole thing started. John didn't expect them to become friends, and honestly, he didn't want to. But he took it as a sign that maybe, just maybe, she'd learned something from all of this. And if she hadn't, well, the mailbox was still there. Waiting by the time winter came, the incident had faded into neighborhood lore. New residents would hear about it from the old ones, usually over backyard fences or during casual chats on the sidewalk. The story always started the same way. There was this lady on the HOA board who kept running over her neighbor's mailbox. And it always ended with the same satisfied conclusion. But one day, she hit the wrong mailbox. Corrected the details. Never tried to make himself look like more of a hero than he was. He knew the truth, and that was enough. On a snowy evening in December, as he stepped outside to clear the driveway, he brushed a light dusting of snow off the mailbox. It stood firm under his hand, unmoving despite the cold wind. He smiled too. Himself, thinking back on the months of frustration, the endless repairs, the late-night planning, and that single, perfect moment when the tables finally turned. It hadn't just been about a mailbox. It had been about refusing to be pushed around. About showing that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or flashy, it's quiet, solid, and impossible to knock down. And every time Karen drove by, giving the mailbox an extra wide berth, John was reminded of one simple truth. Sometimes the smallest victories feel the biggest.